Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I'm Vanessa Quirk. Eric, did you read this story about this team of scientists who have developed a software tool that can automatically make your sentences more polite?
What a fascinating little story, Vanessa. Thank you for bringing it to my attention.
You've downloaded the software tool into your brain, it sounds like.
I'm not sure what you're referring to. But I think my question with this is, it's actually really interesting because it seems to work.
Yes.
But whose standards of polite are they injecting or building into this software tool, right? Because polite by New York standards, there's a lot of shouting involved sometimes. And don't even get me started with New Jersey. I could get Janine in here and she'd tell you about a whole other level of standards.
I mean, the thing that I found funny about this story is that sometimes they made it so polite that it was just false. Did you see that? Like, instead of, hey, that memo was okay, it automatically replaced it to that memo was great. It's like, well, that is kinder, but not really what you wanted to say.
Suddenly, everyone's a lot more productive at work.
Right. I'm feeling really good about themselves.
All right, city lovers, a polite welcome to you this week. This is the Sidewalk Weekly. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world, and we'll chat with journalist Philip Preville about one Midwestern city that's become a national leader in stormwater management. When time's up on a segment, you'll hear our little bicycle bell. This week, our top stories look at getting to net zero by 2050, whether remote work will ruin Silicon Valley, and the battle over urban noise.
Okay, let's dig into these stories.
All right, our first top story comes from David Roberts at Vox, who is writing that the planet needs to get to net zero by 2050, but many of the clean energy technologies that can help us get there and solve this climate crisis, they're nowhere near ready. So, Vanessa, this sounds like a problem.
Yeah, it's not a little one. It's a rather big one. So this piece is really well written, well reported. So let's just get into it. So the baseline understanding here is that climate scientists all agree we need to hit these net zero GHG emissions by 2050, like you said, to stabilize global temperatures. Okay. And so that basically means we have to remove a ton of carbon for every ton that we emit. And this is no small task, right? And so what Roberts is bringing up here is that the time that it normally takes for a technology to reach mass market scale can often be decades. So his point here is that we have to go all in on the technologies that already exist if we're going to hit that ambitious target. Yeah,
and the example he used was really striking to me, which was LED light bulbs. And LED light bulbs apparently were extremely fast to hit the mass market, and they still took 10 to 30 years. So big challenge.
Yes, definitely. And so Roberts here is referring to a new report from the International Energy Agency, and they surveyed technology across a few fields, electrification, carbon capture, hydrogen fuel, and bioenergy. And they identified 400 tools that could help us reach net zero. So this is some good news, right? There's a lot of really great ideas already in the works.
All right, give me the bad news.
Okay, well, it's that in the works part, right? So as you were referring to with the LED light bulbs, the timescales on these can be long. And the report found that the vast majority of these technologies are nowhere near ready to hit the mass market. 75%, in fact, are still in the prototype or the demo or the early adopter phases. And so the IEA writes, this calls for urgent efforts to accelerate innovation.
Yeah. There was another line in here that was even scarier, I thought, which was, quote, there is little or no precedent for the required pace of innovation to get this done here. And so this is a big problem. One of the issues that we talked a little bit about last week is that unless we act really soon, we're going to lock in certain technologies that might be kind of lesser technologies when it comes to their climate impact. We're going to lock them in for decades. So we talked about natural gas last week. Sure, it's cleaner than coal, but it is not as clean as renewables, and it is not net zero. And if utilities make a big investment, say, in natural gas technology today, they're not going to then make another really huge investment in a couple years' time into something that might be cleaner. And so, this investment cycle, David Roberts writes, the next one's supposed to start around 2030. So our window is actually closer to 10 years to get this done, not 30 years.
The way that Sidewalk Labs thinks about this is, and we're really trying to focus our efforts on more clean energy solutions now, today. And I think probably the most pertinent one to this conversation is our work around affordable electrification, which, as you mentioned, it would avoid a lot of the pitfalls of locking into natural gas. And another one I think that's pretty important is mass timber construction, right? Which could kind of push the construction industry forward into a much more sustainable direction, because that timber wood will kind of actually lock in carbon for a longer time frame, which is really important. But the report does make a note of saying that the private sector can only do so much when it comes to these really ambitious targets we have to hit, and that public funding really is critical. And there are some precedents Roberts brings up. He says in 2009, Obama launched the ARPA-E program, which was a part of the stimulus program during the Great Recession, and that was devoted to R&D for clean energy projects. And that actually resulted in a massive spike in R&D funding for clean energy tech, right? So unfortunately, today, our funding levels are actually closer to what they were in the 1970s. Yeah. So obviously, we kind of need to course correct on here and get that funding level up so that public and private sector can work together on accelerating these innovations as fast as we can.
Yeah, I think, it's hard to see how we could get more urgency than we already have around this problem. Again, the good news is that we've got some ideas out there, right? The things you mentioned too, that we're even doing mass timber. It's ready, it's there, but it's not mass market yet. And that's the final step. And that's kind of the critical step if we're going to really meet these steep goals in the time we have left.
Right. The optimistic way of looking at it is at least all the solutions exist. So maybe we should just focus on that part.
I don't know about optimism. Yeah.
All right, on to our next story. So this one comes from Steve Levine. He's writing in a Medium publication called Marker, and he's writing all about Silicon Valley and the tech industry there and how it's really been built on serendipity and chance encounters. So he's asking now, if all workers are going remote because of COVID, will that be the end of the valley, essentially? So Eric, what do you think?
I mean, first I thought this was a really great piece by Steve Levine in Marker. I didn't know Marker, and I encourage folks to check it out. There are also a lot of parallels here between urban life and kind of the post-COVID era that maybe we'll get into in a bit. But, there is clearly a long history of serendipity in Silicon Valley, mattering. It's part of the lore. You have, if you've seen The Social Network, Mark Zuckerberg and Sean Parker kind of meeting that one summer in the same neighborhood. Even going back to the kind of early era of Silicon Valley and Palo Alto being the home of what became Intel from a bunch of engineers who had left another effort. So, the point being that serendipity has kind of defined Silicon Valley. It's part of the culture. It's part of the ethos. It's part of the reason that, a lot of big companies pay hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to design office parks that kind of help people bump into each other and exchange ideas.
Right. I remember covering, the likes of Frank Gehry and Norman Foster were all commissioned to design these very big, beautiful, and supposedly serendipity forcing designs.
Right. Who knows how well they do on that. But, now we have COVID-19 and no matter how well they're designed, they're not going to have people bumping into each other because people aren't going into the office. And so we're seeing more and more companies, including in Silicon Valley, say, you know what? Workers are going to stay remote for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I know Twitter made a lot of the headlines on this, but even Facebook said that maybe up to half of its workers might be permanently remote. And that is a big culture change for Facebook and for the Valley itself.
It's a big culture change, potentially, and it's so big that you even see some startups trying to kind of manufacture serendipity in video calls and Zoom meetings, trying to have little breakout rooms. It's not really the same thing here, but they're trying because it is so important. But so getting back to kind of the article, the provocative point that it really raises is maybe this actually isn't such a bad change because serendipity, for all the good things it has produced, it has actually excluded a lot of people who didn't have access to the same crowds, to the same social scenes. This has contributed to tech's lack of diversity, frankly.
Right. I'm really glad that he brought up this point because I think it's really important and often gets kind of pushed to the side. So, I mean, he writes that from 2000 to 2018, just 2.3% of venture capital funding went to Black founding teams. And last year, only 3% went to female teams. That's according to Crunchbase, right? So those are tiny numbers. And I think this kind of reliance on serendipity of casual encounters is actually in a lot of ways reinforcing this kind of inequitable structure, right? There's some other ways that you can think about, too, about the ways that the Valley kind of perpetuates this inequity. I mean, in terms of geography. for example, right? There's a lot of concentration of tech talent in the Bay Area and other big cities, but there are a lot of entrepreneurs in other cities, in the Rust Belt, for example. And so this kind of shift towards remote work could potentially advantage them for a change. And the interesting thing about that is they often don't have the same kind of culture and values as Silicon Valley. And that could actually be really interesting and potentially a good thing for technology and its future.
Yeah, we've seen stories about that, the rise of the rest movement. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then the other, of course, upside of that is it creates more of chances for affordability, right? I'm thinking of the Tulsa remote program, for example, that encourages kind of remote workers to move to Tulsa and work from there. And that really gives people a chance to live in places where they can afford to make a living wage and have kind of homes that are kind of more suited to maybe families or to wherever they are in their life stages. So I think it's potentially really important change for Silicon Valley and the tech industry as a whole.
Yeah, and Tulsa, obviously not the only city doing this. I think there's a whole bunch that we've been following. Maybe we'll talk more about that soon. But, real quick, because we're running out of time, I do think there's this interesting parallel with what could happen in cities post-COVID, right? Because we know that it is the sidewalk encounters, the exchange of ideas on the streets that are such a big reason that cities are economic engines and kind of fountains of local innovation. This is kind of the basic tenet of Jane Jacobs' thinking in many ways. And we also know that opportunity hasn't extended to everyone, right? The streets and the sidewalks, they don't feel like safe places for everyone. Public parks, the same thing. They're not equally welcome. So while we're in the process of kind of reimagining public space and our relationship to it, and office space and our relationship to it, it's time to really kind of let all of these lessons sink in and think about, is this the future we really want?
Yeah, good point. All right.
Our final top story comes from The Atlantic and Kate Wagner, who is writing about the struggle for the urban soundscape. Really, this is about how kind of the quiet of the COVID lockdown and the noise of many of the protests for racial justice, they have revived a really kind of long-standing debate about, who has the right to silence and who has the right to make noise in the city. So Vanessa, shout out your answer to me.
Well, I'm very surprised that I am actually considering being on the pro-noise camp, but Kate Wagner made some very compelling arguments here, which I had really never thought through. So let me get into what she's writing about here. So she first notes that cities have been much quieter during the COVID lockdown, right? I mean, she's not the only one who's reported on this. A lot of people have noticed, and a few studies have even come out that show it clearly. And Kate Wagner, who lives in DC, actually did her own little sound study to confirm it, walking around her neighborhood with some acoustic measurements, and found a 6 decibel reduction on average, which is pretty big, actually.
Yeah, it might not seem like much, although who knows, but to put it into context, it's the difference between the sound of traffic during rush hour and the sound of traffic at 2 a.m. So that seems pretty big to me.
Pretty significant, right? And so she kind of brings up this point that, in the springtime, people started to get used to this silence. And then in the summertime, that really shifted, right? And a lot of protests for racial justice started hitting city streets, and there were new noises emerging. So not just protests, but police sirens, potentially helicopters in some cities, firecrackers. And so she writes that you get this showdown of silence and noise, which Kate Wagner calls really a struggle for control over city life. And this is kind of the core of what she's talking about here. She's saying that this debate is really about broader issues of environmental, social, and political power. So basically, she's asking here, who has a right to make noise in the city and who doesn't?
Yeah. And I thought this was a really interesting way of framing, something that we just generally think about as kind of annoying, like, oh my gosh, it's so loud outside.
Right.
But there's really this long history here, and there's this rich lens that you can view it through that Kate Wagner takes us through. I really like the history. Some of these very early fights for silence in cities were actually about steamship whistles and those being too loud. Of course, early zoning decisions were largely about noise, trying to separate out factory noise from more quiet residential areas. And then you had kind of anti-noise laws, which, interestingly, as Kate Wagner writes, were actually used as instruments of power, right? These are often pretexts for police to get involved with, say, street vendors or even minority groups who, quote unquote, weren't supposed to be making noise. And so there really is this equity issue here, this social justice issue here. But on the other hand, she also points out, just adding to the complexity, communities of color are disproportionately impacted by the harmful effects of noise pollution, right? Things like stress, hearing loss, high blood pressure, poor sleeping habits. Those hurt everybody, of course, but communities of color get disproportionately impacted. So there are a lot of factors here.
Right. There's no clear right or wrong here. And she writes that, whether or not noise is good or bad is, quote, in the ear of the beholder, right? So if you have a young family, you want to sleep, you're probably looking for a quieter neighborhood. If you move to the city for nightlife, you're probably looking for a livelier, noisier neighborhood. So she kind of brings up that, it really depends on context there. There's also an element of privilege at play as well. So if you can afford, as I recently did, to decamp to the quiet suburbs, then silence is kind of a luxury. Although I have to say, as soon as I came back, I just sat on my balcony for a while, just listening to the noise because it was such a nice and welcome change of pace. But when you think about silence in the city, then if you're enforcing that silence, then you're potentially infringing on people's rights, right? Their rights to protest, maybe even their rights to work and make a living. I'm thinking of all the outdoor cafes right now, which are kind of a lifeline for essential workers and small businesses. So the question is not just who gets to make noise, but as Wagner points out, who gets to make noise about who gets to make noise.
Right. Now, it was a really great way of putting it. And I think something everybody, needs to think more about, technologists and urbanists, because technologists have a role here, which I'll mention in a little bit in terms of kind of noise canceling solutions to some of this. But this is really more and more an issue as we try to create cities that are more mixed use, right? Where residences, shops, and other workplaces, they're mixed together to make that 15-minute neighborhood, to make opportunities closer to where people live, to, reduce costs of living and expand opportunities. And as those things kind of come together, there is this tension about how we determine what noise is acceptable. And it's something we need to start to deal with.
Yeah, and potentially change our zoning laws to respond to that. So, okay, well, that is it for the top stories this week. As always, you can find the links to these stories in the podcast episode notes. In our next segment, we are going to talk with journalist Philip Preville about Kansas City's innovative approach to stormwater management. Back in a sec. We are now joined by journalist Philip Preville, who just completed a really fascinating article for the Sidewalk Talk blog on some new innovations happening in stormwater. Philip, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Vanessa.
Philip, great to have you with us. Can you talk in a broad sense about how big of a problem stormwater overflow and stormwater management is for cities?
I sure can. It's a huge problem, especially for older cities whose construction dates back to the 19th century. And there's a couple of reasons why. The first is what are known as combined sewer systems. In a combined sewer system, that stormwater is combined with household sewage, whatever people are flushing down the toilet or washing down the drain. And that all mixes together. The problem there, of course, is that when you get heavy rains, that combined sewer system overflows. And a mixture of raw sewage ends up flowing through outfalls straight into creeks and rivers rather than going through a wastewater treatment plant. And the second thing that adds to the challenge of stormwater management is climate change, because more intense rainfall events are happening more frequently than they used to.
Right.
All told, this is a problem for about 750 American cities, and we're talking about 850 billion gallons of raw sewage that are being discharged straight into American rivers and streams.
Jeez. It sounds like a nightmare scenario. But fortunately, you do highlight in the piece some cities that are taking actions, and you talk a lot about Kansas City and their approach to handling stormwater. Could you explain how Kansas City's approach is unique?
So the approach that they came up with was what they call a smart sewer program. And it's got two key components. The first is that they decided to go the route of green infrastructure, which is infrastructure that's above ground rather than below ground. And it's designed to retain stormwater and keep it from ever flowing into the sewage system in the first place. And the other thing that makes Kansas City's approach unique is that they've adopted a lot of digital monitoring. The idea that they had was that they want to get the most out of the system they've got. And to do that, you need to know what's actually flowing through it. So they decided they'd start measuring and monitoring.
So let's unpack both of those pieces there from Kansas City, the green infrastructure and the active monitoring. But let's start with the green infrastructure. Can you talk a bit about what that entails and how it helps a city manage its stormwater?
Green infrastructure is usually all about vegetation, planting grasses, shrubs, trees, native plants of all kinds in order to gather rainwater and use it to feed plants rather than sending it straight down the storm drain. Now, people often see this in their cities if they see, trees along the streetscape, along the sidewalk, but they're not always engineered to retain the maximum amount of stormwater. So this is a fairly new development, a new technology that's come along in terms of developing the right mixture of soils and gravel and plants to retain as much stormwater as you possibly can.
Let's dive into the other half of what made the Kansas City program unique, which is the use of sensors, which can help a city know about stormwater coming in even before a storm. So can you explain how it works in Kansas City?
Yeah, they've got a few different types of sensor technology that they use. Some of it is sensors that they have attached to the underside of manhole covers, right? So you've got a sense of how full a sewer pipe is at a given time. The other kind of sensor technology they're using is a cloud-based technology that activates valves. So as an example, they've got a huge 1.2 million gallon stormwater retention basin equipped with a valve that is attached to a sensor that knows not only how much water is in the basin at any particular time, but it also knows what the current weather forecast is and how much rainfall is expected. So based on that information, it can release some of the water in the basin out to the stormwater treatment plant in advance of the next rainstorm coming.
Philip, last one, and we'll let you go here. You mentioned that the stormwater program in Kansas City actually benefited the local community in ways that it really hadn't expected and in ways that went beyond stormwater management itself. So can you talk about what some of those benefits were?
Well, sure. The first community that they used for a pilot project for green infrastructure was a neighborhood known as Marlboro. And it's long been an economically depressed community, but it has a resurgent community coalition. Anyway, when the city approached them about creating new stormwater infrastructure, people didn't realize at the time what the green infrastructure would bring. But some of the green infrastructure is quite expansive, and it's turned old areas of the Marlboro neighborhood into beautiful parks that people want to be in and that are highly used by the community.
And it created jobs too, I think you mentioned.
Yes, it did, because one of the challenges of green infrastructure is that it does need maintenance. And because it wasn't the Parks Department that put it in, the Parks Department wasn't responsible for its maintenance. The city wanted to share that with the community, and the solution they arrived at was a work share program where people who would have difficulty finding other employment elsewhere can find work as maintenance crews for the city's green infrastructure projects, and they get certificates in green infrastructure maintenance at the end of a year.
That's great. Tons of benefits, it sounds like, all around. Thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you, Philip.
It's my pleasure.
It's now time for our final segment, The Last Smile. This is the segment where we set aside the depressing news of the week and we focus on something happy for a minute each. Eric, what had you smiling this week? Apart from my return to New York.
Oh, yeah. That was my choice, right? But then I went with another one just in case we had extra time. And as I promised, I would talk about noise here. And kind of this is a technology of noise story. Researchers in Singapore have built the equivalent of noise-canceling headphones for your whole apartment. This is a story by David Waldstein in the New York Times. The research was published in the journal Science Advances. And basically, this team placed 24 small speakers in a window. They kind of arranged it in such a way that the speakers emitted sound waves that neutralize incoming noise, or they at least decreased that incoming noise by 10 decibels. And now that we're experts in decibels, we know that's quite a bit. Interestingly, however, the human voice does not fall within the sound spectrum that the system is designed to defend against. So you will still hear your neighbors.
What's the point, Eric?
This is the role, this is the role technology can play in some of real city challenges.
Yes. I mean, I will say that I used to teach or volunteer teach at a class in Jackson Heights, which was right by the subway. It's so hard to teach a lesson when a big old train is like barreling by and like makes it impossible to hear. So, I mean, it would be amazing if these things could be installed in schools. I think that could be a great application of this technology.
Very interesting, because there's probably some connection between noise and focus that I'm sure someone can do that study.
For sure.
All right, what had you smiling this week?
Well, as I mentioned, I have returned to the Big Apple here. And one of the first things that I noticed when I got back to my neighborhood was all of the restaurants have bumped out into the parking area outside on the street and created this kind of outdoor dining situation, which is super neat. And then I realized that Diana Budds wrote a really great article for Curbed on just this phenomenon. It's called The Surprisingly Innovative Design of New York's Streeteries. And she says, quote, "These streeteries are among the most exciting designs to enter the public realm in a really long time." She's taking it more from an aesthetic point of view and kind of comparing how well or not well some of these have been designed and kind of noticing, some of the sturdy planters are much more appealing, whereas other kind of tape or whatever is a little bit less so. That said, I think, kudos to the creativity for all of these folks in these small businesses. And I think it's kind of maybe a sign of things to come with more modular, flexible setups in the street. So that's what made me smile this week.
And kudos to the word streeteries, really. I don't know if Diana Budds came up with that, but that's A+ right there.
I agree completely.
All right, time is up, folks. Thank you for joining us this week.
If you'd like to read the stories that we discussed today and many more, then sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk's company position.
And if you think we're missing a perspective, then let us know. Send an email or a voice memo to podcast@sidewalklabs.com.
The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by Vanessa and me. This episode was edited by Zach McNeese. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and our art is by the great Tim Cow. See you next time.